Hi, I'm Calvin Duncan.
Hi, I'm Sophie Cull. Calvin, you spent 28 and a half years in Angola Prison for a murder that you didn't commit. And while you were there, you were a jailhouse lawyer, which in Louisiana we call an inmate counsel substitute, assisting the incarcerated population with their legal cases. And over time, you became the longest serving inmate counsel at that prison and really one of the most renowned jailhouse lawyers in the country. Can you tell me a little about how your journey got started?
Well, it started when I was arrested. Um, I was arrested in Portland, Oregon, for first degree murder for a crime that happened in New Orleans, Louisiana. Initially, I thought that it was I knew it was a mistake, but I thought that they was going to realize that it was a mistake, but they didn't. And I was subsequently extradited to New Orleans. And when I got there, they put me on a unit with guys that already had been to trial, had the death penalty. They had the same lawyer that I had. They had the same judge that I had, and all of them was telling me that I was going to get the death penalty. I was going to be executed,
Mm.
and I was explaining that I can't be executed for a crime I didn't commit. And then they explained to me that they was in front of the same judge, and one of the things they pointed out was that the victim in my crime was white, and the witness in the crime was a white young lady.
Mm.
And therefore, they were saying because of that, and because also that they had the death penalty, and they knew my lawyers, that I was going to be found guilty and given the death penalty. So my question was to them was, well, how can I help myself? And that's when they told me that I had to start studying law, and that's what I did.
We met a few days after you were released from prison, and we were working together at a law office that represented people on death row in Louisiana. As I got to know you and you told me your story, we became good friends and ended up spending a lot of time on road trips together and working on cases together. And as that friendship developed and I learned more of your story, I think two of the things that really struck me about you personally, in the role that you were in, but also you as an individual, was first of all that you had endured this incredible injustice, and that injustice really was rooted in a whole range of injustices that our system perpetuates at a broad level. But you within that system really saw your own role clearly as someone who could still do something about the situation that they were in, but also do something for other people and the situations they found themselves in. And so what's really remarkable to me about your story is both what it reveals about the failures of our justice system, but also the incredible opportunity that you created for others by really knowing the power that you had as an individual in that system. And I just wondered if you could talk a little about what writing this book has meant to you and what you hope people will take away from it.
Yeah. So when I got out of January the 7th, 2011, um, several days later, I applied for a job that's the law firm, the Capital Appeals Project, and they was responsible for representing people that actually was sentenced to death, and that was my job for 19 years. So when I got out, I applied for a job, and I was given a job as a paralegal, and that's when I met you, and sometimes you and I and Biddish would actually go for walks to the coffee shop,
Mhm.
and I would you know share some of the stories, and why I felt comfortable sharing my story with you is because when I would tell other people about my experience in prison or what happened in prison and the criminal justice system, a lot of people didn't. It was like, they didn't actually believe me. And so it became like, well, I shouldn't talk about it. But on our trips to Shreveport, 6 hour long trips, I was able to actually talk about my experience. And you listened attentively. You didn't judge me. You didn't give me an impression that, oh, Calvin institutionalized. So over time, I felt comfortable talking to you about actually what happened, and also never wanted to come across as if I was bragging. And you never gave me that impression that I was all puffed up bragging about my situation. You made me feel as though that I wasn't coming across as being institutionalized like other people had done.
Mm.
And so on our long journeys, we talked about my experience as a jailhouse lawyer.
Mhm.
And I really appreciated that because I needed that. And when a lot of people come home from prison, especially people that's innocent, we need somebody to talk to. And you was kind of like my therapist, and
I would say too, you helped me as well. You wouldn't have realized it at the time, but I was a young person who had come from Australia and was working in this place where I was seeing incredible suffering at the hands of the criminal justice system and what it was doing to other young Black men like you who had found themselves in these situations where they were facing the death penalty and their life was on the line. And I had a lot to learn about how to understand that and what role I could play to support them in that was meaningful in a world that just felt sort of all-consuming. And speaking to you and hearing about your experiences and seeing that you had gone through that and come out the other side to be the man that you were, and sort of found a way to endure that suffering, but also resist it, really helped me understand what role I needed to play as an advocate in the system and how to empower people, not just support them. So I really appreciated what you gave me in that time too.
Yeah, and then being able to tell all those stories, and I always say you got a good memory. You remember all those stories about Miss Rabelais, about Weasel and Duggar, and other people would ask me about writing a book, but it's like, no, I don't want to write a book because I know I couldn't write it because I don't mind talking about my experience, but I never want to come across as if I'm bragging about it or that. So I never could have written a book by myself. So, but I knew when we decided to write the book, I know I could trust you to write it the way it actually, to tell a story the way I would have told it, and us collaborating back and forward. That's really, and we did it. Now the world can actually read about our criminal justice system from a person that actually experienced it.
I'm really grateful for the time we got to spend working on it together. I think the reason I remember those things so well is because the stories mean so much and are so impactful. I'd love to ask you about some of those. But one thing, when I think about what always came through in the way that you told those stories and talked about your experience at Angola, was even though you were a leader in that community and did so much on your own, there was also a whole group of people, your elders, your students, who came together to really face that injustice, not just on their own, but collectively. And I wondered if you wanted to sort of speak to what you hope readers will take away when they read those stories of what men at Angola did together.
One of the reasons why I wanted to really tell the world about what happened was that we often hear about, people that have experienced what I experienced. We hear about it. We read it from other people talking about it, like in court opinions or somebody else writing a book about it. And it never shows us. It never showed Black men. And so I wanted the world to see that there was once in a lifetime of our memory, that there was once the Black men actually came together to help each other in the darkest place in the world, which was Angola. Some of us was didn't commit our crime. Some of us committed our crime. But I wanted the world to see that here is some, because we often, like, at least where I'm from in the South, we often hear negative stories about Black men in Louisiana, nothing
Mhm.
positive. But I wanted the world to see that there, in spite of our circumstances, we came together, we educated ourselves, we championed other people or causes, we protected other people's rights. We tried to get, access to the courts like every ordinary person would be. And we lived as human beings,
Mhm.
as opposed to what they hear about, people in prison, they do bad things. I've always heard all those negative stories about us, but I wanted the world to hear about, me, Norris, Chico, Wilbur, Gary Tyler, how we actually came together and help
Mhm.
each other and learn how to read, help each other about how to access the court, how to research our cases.
Mhm.
And me in my role as being a lawyer. That,
Can I ask you about that?
yeah.
Because a lot of people will have heard the term jailhouse lawyer and think that that's, we might associate that with someone in a jail cell writing a motion in exchange for a pack of cigarettes.
Yeah.
That's really not, that doesn't capture the role that you played as an inmate counsel at Angola. So maybe you could just explain what a jailhouse lawyer is.
So a jailhouse lawyer is a lawyer that's in jail. And so in Louisiana, once a person is convicted and their case has been appealed to the Court of Appeals, um, under Louisiana law, we no longer are entitled to a lawyer, even if we innocent, even if our trials wasn't fair. And so at Angola, we had a system called the inmate counsel substitute, which is a jailhouse lawyers. Um, and our responsibility was to review people cases. And if we're in reviewing the cases, we determined that the individuals wasn't afforded a fair trial. It was our responsibility. Some people are taken back and they question, do they actually have a job in prison that allow you all to actually do that? And the answer is yes. Our job was to review those cases. Um, and if we determined that a person from reading the transcript and the issues that had happened in their case that they wasn't afforded a fair trial, we were responsible for actually trying to get this individual back in the court, convince a judge, look at the pleading that we just prepared, look at this guy's transcript, and he wasn't afforded a fair trial, and therefore he should be given a new trial. In some of the cases, we we came across that the guys was innocent, like myself.
Mm.
And our job was to actually function like lawyers. One of the things that we couldn't do in prison was leave the prison, and we couldn't do no physical research other than write letters for somebody for the guy's documents. So our job as a jailhouse lawyer was the same as the job of a lawyer that's actually on the outside. Other than we have very little education when like in my case, I had a ninth grade education,
Mm.
and some of my colleagues that was actually jailhouse lawyers, they had very little education. Some of us never we didn't even have our GED, but we 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 decided that we could make a difference, and we needed to make this difference because it was nobody. We weren't entitled to a lawyer, and we didn't have the funds to hire lawyers. We had an office, we had a library, um, and it's sometimes very rarely we get lucky that we can actually convince a lawyer alone on the outside to come help us.
Mm.
So
But that was a really rare thing, right?
very rare.
And that was in an institution where most of the people were serving sentences that would have them die in prison without any help.
Yeah, in
So,
Louisiana, life means life in prison. You die in prison. We in Louisiana, we have this graveyard. When I first got there, it was Perk Lookout 1.
mm,
By the time I left, they had Perk Lookout 2, and it was half full. In a lot of those cases, the guys wasn't afforded fair trials, and so um, the only person there to help them was us. And I'm often, I often remind people that the, the guy that actually convinced the United States Supreme Court that people in prison that can't afford lawyers should be given lawyers and the government should pay for it, and that the Sixth Amendment right to counsel should apply to the states. And that guy, Gideon, Clarence Gideon, he was a jailhouse lawyer. And if it wasn't for Gideon actually telling the Supreme Court, this is not fair. We in prison, you're asking us to do a job that only lawyers can actually do, that have the training, but you're asking us to do it. And, the Sixth Amendment right to counsel should be afforded to the state, people that's in state prison. And I have to remind people that Gideon was a jailhouse lawyer.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that, because I think one thing that we sort of don't appreciate is how few people in prison can actually afford legal help. And so what you end up having is a system that if you have money, you can afford to get a lawyer, you can get help. If you don't have money, or if you grew up poor, or you don't have family on the outside who have resources, you're stuck and you're completely alone. And so we have a bifurcated system, the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah.
And there's very few haves. So you really were assisting a population of around 6,000 people at the height of your career. That's a lot of people serving very long sentences who need help. And they had you and a team of jailhouse lawyers, and that was it. So I wanted to ask, I know that you did a lot of criminal work, but I also wanted to ask about, tell me about the work you did on the civil side when you were working at the mental health unit. Was there any cases that you worked on there, people that you helped that you would want to share?
Yeah, so I was in the parish jail awaiting trial. Sometime I would get sent to solitary confinement for fighting. Sometime I got sent to solitary confinement for just having too much legal work. And so what I would do is if they took my legal work while I was in the parish jail, I would file a 1983. And then in some instance, when people would come back from Angola that needed dentures, I actually would file a 1983 action for them with the argument that their rights under the Eighth Amendment is being violated because they need dentures actually to properly chew their food. So by the time that I got to Angola, I was considered really a civil rights lawyer. The guy that is, if a guard beat them, or if the guard did something that they wasn't supposed to do, or didn't protect them, I would be the one that actually filed a suit against the guards. So by the time I got to Angola, I was well known. And so so I applied for the job as a jailhouse lawyer and inmate counsel substitute, and I was assigned to the mental health unit. The mental health unit housed people that had serious mental issues. In one particular case, and it is talked about in the book, this guy, he was self-mutilate himself. And it was because of his mental illness. One day I was walking down the tier and I saw him trying to use the bathroom. And his private area had gangrene on it. And so I went to one of the social workers and I said, look, this guy having problems. And it was like, well, he always do this to himself. I said, can you get him to the hospital? It was like, no, because he's just going to keep on doing it. And then I went to a friend of mine, an elder. His name is Wally Moo. And I explained to him all of the inhumane treatment that I was witnessing on the mental health unit. And what he told me was, he told me that it was my job. He said it was my job to protect them. Mm-hmm. And so I started filing 1983 actions about the condition at the mental health unit. And that's when I found purpose in helping other people, because I always helped a lot of people, but now I'm in Angola. There's nowhere else to go. I'm away from the parish jail, but I'm like, I want to help myself to get out of prison too. But then Wally Moon said, "Well, man, you have to help these guys because if it's nobody else that there to help them." And I started helping, and then I started filing suits on behalf of this guy that had the mental issues to get him medical treatment that he needed.
Did he get that treatment?
Or did he get it? Yes. We went to court. We went to trial, and it was like the judge was awesome. She even had one of the medical directors to come to the court to explain the medical records to us. And ultimately he got the treatment that he needed. At least he got to see a doctor. That's one of the highlights of my experience as a jailhouse lawyer, helping somebody that really just couldn't help himself. And that's that fit my personality. And then he did get some help. But then, although I got him some help, but then the institution retaliated and moved him. And I felt bad about that. Was I making his situation worse than what it was? Yeah.
Well, that's one of the complexities of your job. It sounds to me, as you describe that, you did it at great risk to your own situation, because if you are filing suits against the prison, they could not take kindly to that, and that could have consequences for you as someone working in the law library and doing your best on your own case to try to get someone to take notice of your situation, that you're doing this work sort of at risk to yourself.
Yeah. But I had people like Wally Moon saying, "You have to do it." One of my favorite books was The Cider House Rule, where Dr. Larch tells, Dr. Larch was responsible for helping people that couldn't help themselves. And he tells this little kid, Homer, he said, no matter what the circumstances, no matter where you're at in life, you have to be of use. So Wally Moon, gave me the purpose, and one of the things that stuck out in that book of being of use. I have to be of use. I have to do something with the time that I had, and then I had life imprisonment. I had my destiny. I was destined to die right there. So, yeah.
So Calvin, hearing you talk about being of use makes me think about what really made me want to originally write this book with you, or one of the questions that I had that I really hoped the process of writing the book would help me answer. And it's a really distinct memory I have of a day when we went walking to a coffee shop from near the office. You and I were walking down Baroon Street, and you pointed out a hotel. And you told me that you used to work in that hotel as a teenager, as the night manager. And you pointed out a door on the side of the hotel where you said that you would let people who were living on the street come in and sneak into the hotel so that they could shower and rest in unoccupied rooms and get a hot plate of food from the kitchen. And I remember thinking, as you told me that story, that sense of justice existed in you long before you were wrongfully convicted. And that really raised the question for me of what made Calvin Duncan the man that he is. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about this idea of being of use.
Yeah.
And sort of how you think about how you formed that idea as a young person.
Yeah, I was 17 years old then. I had got a job at the hotel is Le Pavillon on Baron Street. I was a supervisor, and my job was the night manager over the kitchen area, and the cleaning. My job was to make sure that everything was clean and ready for the next day. But it was me and another person working, but I always had to hire or find other people to come help us. So what I would do, and they had people, homeless people would show up, and I would actually get, you know, like 2 or 3 of them, and then I would have them work an 8-hour shift with us. And they had one lady, um, she would be out there as well. So I always was, you know, she was, I would always get her to work with us. And her job, I told her, I said, look, your job is to help us, with the cleaning up, but that's just for the real boss. But with us, your job is just to cook for us. And she would cook meals, for me and for other people that was homeless that was working with us. And then there was sometimes that I would actually let them, sneak in the rooms and just take a shower, wash their clothes. And I was 17 at that time.
Mm.
And yeah, so I think it's just being of use has always been a part of my personality, helping other people. And then I wound up in prison and found the way to be of use there. And then I read about, this when I read the Cider House Rule, it just was something that I shared with the prison population. No matter what your circumstances, you have to be of use. And although some of us, was enough, most of us had life sentence. We was never going home, but we still had to be of use. Yeah, that was with me from a very young age when I was working. And so, yeah, I appreciate, thinking about that conversation on Barone, Le Pavillon. And that hotel is still there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And every time
I think about it every time I see it.
Every time I walk past that hotel, I think about what I was doing. As a matter of fact, I don't mind saying this. They had a security guard. He hated me. But he couldn't catch me. He couldn't catch what I was.
He hated you because you were letting people
Yes,
in
he
like
didn't
that?
like it. He didn't like it. He didn't like it at all. He didn't like. And one time, I shouldn't be proud of this, but I'm proud of this. I took his leather coat and gave it to one of them homeless people. And he knew, he said, I know you took my coat. I know I'm going to catch you. And then they had another lady, Cheryl. She had a lot of kids, and her husband was in jail. So, all of the food that they was throwing away, I was like, Cheryl, come, you could get this food and bring it home.
Mm.
But that guard, I don't remember what his name is, but he hated me. And I gave him good reasons to hate me. I took his leather coat and gave it to a person that was homeless.
Calvin, thinking forward then ahead to your time working as a jailhouse lawyer in the prison, you said you sort of started that journey with a 9th grade education. Basically, you had to teach yourself to read, but you worked your way up into this senior position as the head inmate counsel. And you really were on that journey at a time in the U.S. when mass incarceration was coming to be what we know it as today. More and more policies were sending more and more people into our prisons and jails for longer and longer periods of time. And as you sort of were a part of that, you also watched it from the inside. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about what changes were happening in that time that made it harder for people without lawyers to access the courts.
Yep. So like in the book, we talk about some of those procedural bars. Like during that time, we didn't have a time limitation, to file out on our cases. Mm-hmm. But then they enacted a time limitation we called it 930.8. That was the law that was enacted, and it gave people 3 years to file an application challenging their conviction, or they'd be procedurally barred. But people whose conviction had already been final, they gave us 1 year, and that was everybody. That was like 75% of the population
had 1 year to file their appeal.
And once
And what would happen if they didn't file by
they
the
would
deadline?
be procedurally barred from court.
And what meaning that they couldn't ever
They could never
have
they
these?
could never litigate their cases. They would even although they wasn't afforded a fair trial, they couldn't even petition the court for relief. And so what we did together is that first I brought that to the attention to my supervisor, Ms. Dora Rabelais, and I explained to her that if we had to do something because everybody in this prison was going to be procedurally barred from court. We wasn't going to be able to petition the court for relief. And it's pointed out in the book, we talked about what can we do to make sure that people litigate their cases on time. And we came together, and we actually filed help people that wanted to file their application to prevent them from being barred.
Can you tell that story in more detail, starting with when you shared with Ms. Rabelais that this new law had come into effect?
Yeah. So what we actually did, so I asked her to try to convince one of the law schools to come help us to meet everybody's deadline, but that didn't materialize. So then what we did, we actually spoke with the warden, and we explained to the warden that they just passed the law to prevent all of us from filing on our cases, even people that was innocent. And so the warden and all of us got together, and we devised not a scheme, but a plan to really one day we was going to really stop everything in the prison. We went on the radios, we went on the units, and we actually assisted everybody that wanted to file an application. And that was kind of like that's another moment of my experience on as a jailhouse lawyer that I'm really proud of, that we actually came together as one, the institution in us, to make sure that people was not going to be procedurally barred in litigating their cases and proving to the court that they wasn't afforded a fair trial.
Calvin, when you first came home, we got to work together, and it was really early in your journey since your release. And I remember one day that we were preparing for a board meeting in the office, and you and I were helping by cutting up vegetables for like a platter that the board could eat during the meeting. And I said, Calvin, you want to cut up the tomatoes? And you looked at me holding a knife out to you and said, I need a moment to I can do it, but I need a moment because it's so strange to hold a knife after all of that time, where that would have been a huge rule violation had you locked up inside of prison. So there must have been so many small details like that when you first came home that someone from the outside would never appreciate or imagine. Could you speak a little bit about what it was like when you first came home?
Yeah, so when the judge gave me this, when I went back to the prison to be released, I gave all of my everything. I gave my toothpaste away, my toothbrush away, all my clothes, and when I
to other people in
the prison, and I had a pair of shoes that actually that I kept that I said I'm gonna wear these pair of shoes my lawyer's shoes when I get out, be exonerated, and it took so long for that to happen. By the time I put them on, they became dry rot. But one of the things that really shocked me that had changed from me going in and going out is cell phones. That was the first thing that really, really, it freaked me out. And I could still remember my lawyer giving me this little thing and saying somebody want to talk to you. I'm used to a hand phone. Even in prison, we have, wall phones. And she gave me this phone, and I started shaking. And she wound up taking it away from me. Having a cell phone in prison was contraband. But then adjusting to just the outside world, that was like, what I'm going to eat, where I'm going to go, where I'm going to sleep. and I knew what my lawyers for a total of 8 days. Then I moved into the resurrection after exoneration, that actually housed people that had been wrongfully convicted for a period of time. But just being in prison, being told what to do, all for close to 30 years, not have to wonder what I'm gonna eat, what I'm gonna wear, and just talking to people, not all the normal people, because I'm used to talking to us. Where I didn't have to figure none of that stuff out. And
I remember we would go to, coffee shops or lunch places on our trips, and you would just look at the menu and say, pick something. I don't care what it is.
Even right now, it's like they say, well, Cal, you look at the menu and see what you want. It's like, well, I'm going to look what y'all want.
Yeah.
Just making those decisions that I didn't have to make for all of those years that I was in prison.
And just one final question about that. I know, you finally got what you've been working for all these years, to be released, to be free. But I remember that also that came with a continual sense of that things could still change at any point. And what's it like to actually live on the outside?
When I got out, I knew from experience, some of the people that I helped that got out of prison, they would come back to prison within like 3 months. So in my mind, I knew I was going back to prison in 3 months. And so I was trying to do everything that I could possibly do, like go to the river wall, wake up early in the morning, just walk and just enjoy my freedom. So in a nutshell, accepting that I was free was a challenge for me as well, because I'm thinking that I'm going back to prison, because I know a lot of people did go back to prison within 3 months. So I'm thinking I'm going back. So just accepting that I'm free was a challenge.